Hey guys, so today we're going to make a System of a Down style track and it's going to sound like this. Now you may be thinking that this one's going to be a simpler video because System of a Down is just like four dudes going crazy on their instruments, right? You know, it doesn't sound overproduced, doesn't sound like a bunch of weird studio wizardry. But think about this, have you ever heard another band that sounds anything like System of a Down, this hugely influential band that surely a lot of people want to sound like? Because I certainly haven't, and that's partially because they're four very creative dudes with their own unique sounds, but also Rick Rubin produced all their albums. So put all those ingredients together and you have something that, yes, it may seem kind of simple and has like a live organic sound, but trust me, System of a Down has some next level production. So let's jump in, and as usual, I have a bunch of my own presets here that I've made, so we'll go through these one by one and build this track out from scratch, starting with some guitars. I want to lay down like a minor melodic intro, thinking like ATWA, Aerials, Lonely Day, you get the idea. So I'm in drop C tuning, let's see what we can get. Okay, that's definitely the one that completely has the System vibe, super minor, and then it kind of just goes up and down the minor scale, which is a very System of a Down thing to do. And then a little bit of dissonance there with that major seventh. Classic System way to end a riff. So this will be our starting point. Let's lay it down and then I'll break down the sound. So we're starting off completely natural minor. System tends to use the natural minor scale, but they like to dip their toes in other scales here and there, so we'll explore a little bit of that later on. But for now, this is perfect. So we're starting off quite easy. Darren's clean tones do tend to be quite basic, so I'm using this Marshall Lead 12, which is actually a free plugin, and this is the perfect amp for this kind of sound, because it's not too modern and squeaky clean, you know, it's got that mid-range, it's just got like a slightly more old school sound. So we're going to start with that, but it sounds a little bit too basic to me. So I'm thinking let's bring in a lo-fi plugin, because the amp, as close as it is to the sound we want, sounds a little bit cheap and digital to me, so this can maybe make it a little more grainy and old school, and kind of convince your ear a bit more that it is actually like an old school amp and not like some modern digital amp sim. So let's experiment with some of these filters and just take it a little more old school, nothing too extreme. So let me put the mix at 100. Okay, obviously that's too extreme. I like that. Yeah, let's try the 60s setting and just blend a tiny bit of it in. So we're only trying to make a small difference with that, but for me it kind of tricks my ear a little more and tells me like that is a mic'd amp in a room rather than like a free digital amp sim, which it is. Alright, and before we move on, that just sounds a little bit dull to me, so let's just make it sparkle a little bit more with some fresh air. That sounds like System to me, it's just a little more clear on the top end. Alright, and let's just pan this slightly over to the right, because I want to add a second guitar track and I want to create a little bit of separation between the two. So we have another track here and I'm just going to pan it. Let's put it like 40% to the left. So for this one, let's use the 14 Kelly. Amazing for cleans and kind of has a Marshall sound in my opinion, so. But I do want to let this tone sit in the background and kind of fill out the mid-range a bit more, so. There you go, boost some mids, cut some treble. So what I'm going to do here is something that System does a lot in their intros, kind of like a background drone rather than like an upfront part. So what we have in the main part is, so I want to take the low part and let's kind of emphasize that and fill out the mid-range so it's kind of more atmospheric and vibey in the intro. Let's do kind of the Aerials, Holy Mountain picking, like, you know. adds so much when it comes in. Just fills out the atmosphere. But still, this needs to sound bigger. System intros, Holy Mountains and Aerials, for example, really have those like big effects in the intro. So let's maybe try some chorus to just expand the sound and make it kind of thicker. Oh yeah, that's exactly what we need. Stock settings, let's just turn it down a little bit. Hear how that just makes it all encompassing, it just surrounds you. That's System of a Down. So that's our intro, and for ease, let me just copy it over. But now I want to step it up a little bit in the verse. So let's bring in some drums and some bass guitar, and I'll break down the sounds for those in a minute. But first, let's just get it laid down. So for this part, we're going to keep it pretty chill so it works with the guitars, but John has a lot of groove, so we'll add a little bit of flavor in there. I'm thinking like bum 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 bum, like this. Yeah, I like that. Let's turn them down a little bit. We don't want it too aggressive in the verse. And let's just keep copying that over. And the same kind of thing for the snare. Something kind of grooving, but slow. Maybe a couple of ghost notes like this. Turn them down a little so it's nice and chill. Ghost note again. And maybe some ride cymbal here. I feel like he likes to kind of play with the ride when it's more chill. Let's put like a quiet crash on the first beat of each bar, and then just like some really nice chill. You know, if we turn these down a bit. I can totally hear Serge and Darren singing on this, so we must be doing something right. All right, before we break down those drum sounds, let me just track some bass. So we're just following root notes with the bass, and I love Shavo's tone, honestly. Like, it is so underrated, and I get why people don't talk about it, because it's not like Tool or Korn where the bass jumps out at you. It's a very understated tone. The bass in System of a Down is generally just about making the guitars feel big. It's not trying to do its own thing. But man, this kind of tone is like my favorite. It's so aggressive but clean. It's not like a modern tone where you've got all this like hissy distortion and this insane compression. It's like so alive, so punchy, so mid-rangey. So this verse is really starting to come together, and before we break down those bass and drum sounds, let me just quickly track some guitars to kind of lead us towards a chorus. So we'll let it run once, and then let's get super nasty. Okay, now we're ready for some super heavy system riffs. I just want to jump in, guys, to say if you're enjoying this video, hit the like, subscribe so you don't miss all the videos that I have coming up. And if you want to dive deeper with all this stuff, definitely keep an eye on the channel, because I have some online courses on the way that I think are going to answer a lot of questions for a lot of you and just help you to understand a lot more about mixing, producing, all of it. So if you want to stay in the loop about all of that, definitely make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss anything. Let's get back into it. All right, so we're ready to lay down a heavy chorus, and before we approach the drums, we need to talk a little bit about Armenian rhythms, because one of the things that makes this band so special and sets them apart from every other band is that it's so intrinsically Armenian. Like, you listen to any metal band from around System's time, no one was using their rhythms. Not only is it really cool that it just sounds Armenian, but the fact that these Armenian rhythms work so well in a metal context just makes this band so special. So for the chorus, let's try and find some like dancey kick pattern that feels Armenian. In this tempo, bum bum badum bum bum bum, something like that maybe. Bum bum badum bum, like that. Add that snare hitting hard on the downbeat. Let's try that. Oh yeah, that's System of a Down. And cymbal wise, this is definitely where John would be like, you know, we'll put a crash on the first beat, but this is definitely where John would be riding the open hats. Okay, then maybe here we go like half time. Bum. Bum, bum, kind of that epic System of a Down, you know, almost like Chop Suey. Forsaken me. So, like this. Make the snares half time like this. And since we're slowing it down here, let's kind of let the cymbals go all over the place. They can dance around a little. This is going to be insane when we have some guitars on it. All right, so for the drums, I'm using the Get Good Drums metal kit. No surprise there. And that kick, it's pretty good out the box, but it's a little too modern and slappy for me. So let's take some of that high end out and maybe enhance the low end. So it's more of a thump. The system kick is much more of a like low end thump rather than like a clicky, you know, metalcore kick. Just slightly taming that high end. And last thing, let's just enhance the sub with our bass. That's a lot more like the system kick now. And the first thing I want to do with the snare is just gate it. It was just fizzling out a bit too much. And other than that, we just need to get it to pop a little harder. The system snare is a little higher tuned, a little more popping than this. This is a bit more boomy. So first thing I want to do is some compression because that always helps the snare to pop harder. So let's just slam it with a bit of OTT because that always helps the snare to pop. With it being multiband as well, we can boost the highs. So let's try just a bit of this. Really using this to get those snappy highs that we need. So I'm happy with the Get Good Drums snare, but I feel like we can take it a little further with this UJam Brute plugin because this has some really nice high-tuned snappy snares. So let's see if we can layer one of these with our main snare to get more of that snap we need. Okay, that one sounds great to me. It just needs to pop a little harder in the high end. So let's just bring in fresh air. There we go. That's all it needs. Layer that with our main snare and we get this. Just adds that extra little bit of snap. So it really sounds like a high tune banging snare. All right, and system have a pretty natural cymbal sound, so we don't need to do too much, but I want to compress a little bit so that in the chorus where we need the energy to stay up, the cymbals aren't dropping too much and it's staying kind of consistent in your ear. Compression is always a powerful tool for cymbals. If you don't want it to be lifeless, you want to bring the energy up a little bit. So again, we'll just bring in LA, 2A and OTT. Just boost a little bit with both of them. That's all it needs. The Get Good Drums cymbals are awesome. Okay, onto the bass. And in the chorus, I want to kind of follow the same riff we had with the climbing up the scale. But let's just add some passing notes, a bit more rhythm. So something more like this. Like I said before, I love Shavo's bass tone. I don't know what it is about producers around like the early 2000s, but System, Rage Against the Machine, like the video I did a couple of weeks ago, and even Saint Anger, they all had like the similar bass tone that was only from that time, that was just so aggressive. And personally, I love it way more than modern metal bass tones. Like this is the bass tone for me. It's so mid-rangey and so punchy. So we're going to start off with this bass amp in Cubase called iTech. These Cubase amps are really, really good if you want like an old school sound. They're not very good for modern bass sounds, but if you want like a grungy 90s sound, it's perfect. So that's what we're going to use. The only thing is this bass amp is kind of all over the place frequency wise. You know, it's got that sound we want, it's got the mid-range, it's got the power, but the frequencies are just out of control. So let's bring in a parametric EQ. You know, you can play with the bass, mid, and treble on the amp as much as you want, but sometimes it's nice to get more surgical. So like I said, it's getting way too blown out in the low mids. So let's put a pretty deep cut in the low mid range. You can see here it's jumping way too high. We don't want it that unbalanced, so that's good. There's also some kind of honky high mids. And the only other step I want to do is just make it a bit more aggressive. At this stage, it sounds like Shavo's tone, but it just sounds a little bit chill, a little bit in the background. So let's make it more aggressive with this Cubase multiband distortion. I love this thing, recently discovered it, and it's so cool. The low end, we don't really need to touch it. Don't really need much from the low mids. There you go, the high mids. That's where we need some distortion. Usually you would use something like a bass driver, but I just have fallen in love with this multiband plugin, so we're using that. But you could use any kind of bass distortion to kind of boost in front of the amp here. And with that distortion, we're really just looking for the punchy mid-range because, you know, Chavo plays with a pick and you can really hear it in his music, especially if you listen to the isolated bass tracks. You can just hear him picking so hard. So that's what we're trying to emphasize without getting the clicky high end, because we don't need that. All right, so now we're ready to track some heavy guitars and finally get into that brutal, aggressive, beautiful System of a Down guitar tone. So again, we're following those same notes, keeping it all natural minor for now. We're just adding some chuggy passing notes. And then the quintessential parts of Darren's playing, like the chuggy parts, the natural minor, and then he loves like fast little minor runs with a bit of palm muting. And Darren's guitar tone is one of my favorite guitar tones of all time. And like I said earlier, I have never heard another band with a similar tone to what this band has, especially after the first album. Toxicity and Steal This Album just have the most brutal sound ever. And the last two albums are like a tightened up version of that brutal Toxicity tone. So we're going for something between the two, with the brutality of Toxicity, but the cutting, crisp crunchiness of the last two albums. And System's tone is a great example of don't just buy the same gear. Like everyone knows that Darren uses a JCM 800 amp and an Ibanez Iceman guitar. But Rick Rubin was in the studio with him, and I don't know what Rick was doing, but I guarantee it was some next level production. They definitely were experimenting a lot with different pedal setups, reamping, layering, and just outside of the box recording techniques. I can hear it on the albums that it's not just a guitar and an amp and a guy playing it. There's some crazy shit going on for sure. So for this tone, let's start on the left channel, and we are going to start with the JCM 800. This is the Archetype Tim Henson plugin, and I'm pretty sure that this pink amp is modeled on a JCM 800. And I can hear the system tone in there somewhere, but we're gonna really need to boost it to bring it out. If you listen to how it sounds out of the box, it's kind of dull, it's kind of lifeless. But it has that chug, it has that system sound. So let's just see how we can bring that out of the tone more. So the first thing is just within this plugin, I wanna crank the boost, I wanna crank the overdrive. But that's still nowhere near as heavy as we need it, so that's just a first little step. In front of that, I want to use my go-to preamp SS11X. Let's use this Tube Screamer with have the tone a little bit up and turn the preamp on. Listen to this. You hear how that brings the tone alive. So if these guys are using JCM 800s, they're definitely doing something in front of the amp to boost the signal before it gets there. So it's super lively and hot before it even hits the amp. So it's sort of getting there, but it sounds a little bit muddy to me still. We need to bring it out of the mud. So this is where we get unconventional. I'm going to use my favorite distortion plugin after the amp. So we're going to use Decapitator and just kind of see if we can shape the tone and boost it more with some saturation. Pull the mix down a little bit. We don't want it all the way up. And let's just try, see if we can make it a little brighter with this. That is exactly what we need. So that's not a conventional move, distortion after the amp, but listen to what Decapitator's doing if I turn it off and then on. Brings it alive completely, makes it a System of a Down tone. And obviously you never know, but listening especially to Toxicity, I feel like I can hear a lot of stuff going on after the amp. Like it just sounds like so much compression, saturation, and different things to really bring it alive as much as possible. And especially if you think about Mesmerize, Hypnotize, this really gives us that bite in the high end that we need. And the last thing I want to do is just take that high end bite a little further even with some EQ. So let's just add a high shelf to emphasize that even more. And that maybe is taking it a little too far, a little too harsh, but keep it in mind. Keep that EQ move in mind because it'll make sense in a minute. So that's what we're doing on the left. Now on the right, we're using a different amp just because A, that's what System tends to do. If you listen to any of their music really carefully, especially with headphones, you can always hear that there's a different amp on each side. And even if it's not system, it's just a good trick to do if you want more depth in your mix. It can really make it sound fuller as long as you balance the two amps with EQ so it's not like unbalanced. You know, it can give you a much bigger mix than just having the same exact thing on both sides. So this amp that we're going to use on the right is again a Marshall, and this is actually a free one. It's based on a Plexi, I believe, which is like a JCM, but we just need to boost it a little more to get that sound. So you can see I've got the gain all the way up. Very rare I turn the gain up to 10, but this is not a super high gain amp, so we actually need it. So with that, it sounds like this. Again, very mesmerized, hypnotized, but it's just a little bit tame. It's not like as blown out as we need it. So let's bring in another preamp. This time I'm going to use this Gainier TD preamp, which I really like as long as you don't overdo it. So let's just add a little bit of a boost from this. You hear the difference in the chugs? And again, with this amp, you can see him kind of leaving the bass and mids alone and then just kind of pushing the highs a little too much. So keep it in mind, just like with the other amp, it will make sense in a minute. So the only other thing I want to do is again run it into Decapitator to just push it even further after the amp. So let's try that. So yeah, after both amps, we're using Decapitator for saturation and distortion, which I've never done before, never thought to do it before, but it was just me trying to get system's tone and I could not get something close until I tried this trick. And thinking about it, it makes sense. Decapitator is a saturation plugin, so we're basically taking what is coming out the amp and making it fuller, adding to it, making it bigger. And the System of a Down guitar sound is as big as possible, so it makes complete sense really that we're doing this. So I mentioned how I want to go for something between kind of early system and late system. These two amps are basically the late system sound for me. They're a little more distorted, but they definitely don't have that full low-end brutality of Toxicity. But they're giving us that super responsive, crunchy, bright, high-end tone that we need. Now we just need something that can sit under those and add that aggression in the low end. And this is why we made those two amps a little bit too bright, because we're going to layer something that's got all this low-mid brutality and it's going to make the overall guitar sound lower and heavier. And don't worry, this is a little more simple. We're going to have the same sound on the left and right, but we're just layering a second tone. And the Toxicity tone that we're going for here, it's almost like a fuzz tone. It's such a different type of distortion. It doesn't quite have the clarity of the later System albums, but it is just brutal, and the distortion is just something else. So for this sound, we're going to be using another stock Cubase amp, and this one's called Diamond. I don't even know what it's modeled on, but it's definitely something modern and high gain. So the distortion of this Cubase amp is really nice. But I'm only using the amp head here, so I've turned off the cab, and you can see here I'm using the 14 Kelly, but just the cab. So I've turned off everything else. So we're using the head from the Cubase amp, the cab from the 14 Kelly. This is a really good cab for high gain sounds. It has that low mid range. It's not too modern sounding. Kind of checks all the boxes for System of a Down. But we do want to bring it alive a little more. So I'm going to do the same trick. Let's use SS11X, but any preamp or kind of tube screamer would be good. And if we turn on this preamp, let's turn it off and then on, and you'll hear how it doesn't lose any of the aggression. It's still got all that distortion, but this kind of gives a bit more definition to the chugs. So it kind of has that clarity that you associate with the system tone. So here it is without the preamp and then with. Listen to the chugs especially. Just brings it out the mud. And let's take that further with the precision drive. This pedal is absolutely perfect if you want to get a tighter sound. So again, listen without this and with it, it doesn't lose any of the distortion, any of the brutality, but it just tightens everything up and really lets you hear the pick hitting the strings. So that's getting close to the early system tone now. The only thing I think is missing is just that it doesn't quite sound low enough. And this is another thing where we're going to go unconventional. I was trying to get this tone and I was like, it's not low enough, but it's not the tuning. We're in drop C, that system. It's not the EQ, everything sounds right, but it just kind of sounds like it's up here and I want to bring it just a little bit down. So this is one of those things where they definitely did not do this trick in the studio, but for me, this just helped me to get closer to the system sound. So we're not going to change the pitch of the sound, we're just going to change the formant. So that's like the shape of the sound. Listen, if I do this really aggressively, you'll hear how it doesn't change the pitch, but it kind of makes it a different shape. So I just want to bring this down a little bit so that it just chugs a little harder, because the Toxicity tone, it feels like it's so down here rather than up here. So right there, it's only a tiny little finishing touch, but for me, that kind of changes it from like the later system tone to the earlier one. It's a little bit like using the tone knob on your guitar, but just like a way more extreme version of that. And these little details matter, you know, we want that Toxicity growl, so kind of helps us get there. All right, and lastly, I just want to track something super chaotic and frantic. It wouldn't be System without a crazy dissonant thrashy section, so let's do that now. And when System goes crazy, they go crazy. So with the drums, let's start with just, you know, I'm not going to be delicate about it. We just want brutality. Same thing with the snares. And the same with the cymbals. When it's raging, it has to rage. System does not hold anything back. And let's get like really blast beat here, like some ride hits. All right, let's lay down a really fast guitar riff on that. And this is where we're going to finally leave the minor scale and get a little bit more experimental. So you remember how earlier we were saying System tends to be natural minor. But they love to explore other scales a little bit. So one thing they love is major sevenths, just throwing a couple of those in. And they also love minor seconds. So like throwing a little Phrygian in there. And sometimes, to be honest, they like to just go completely crazy. For example, like sometimes it's completely abstract, but a lot of the time it's, you know, a kind of Middle Eastern vibe. So we're basically borrowing a few of those notes from the more Middle Eastern scales. So we've got the major seventh and then the minor second. So it's, and then minor, minor. So it's kind of like we're getting that dramatic dissonant start of the riff. And then reminding the listener, it's still, you know, there's a melody there, it's still minor, but they love throwing in the kind of like, everything's like falling apart and, you know, it's chaos. Like, so yeah, definitely the minor second and major seventh is like the chaos notes for System of a Down. Okay, so let's quickly lay down the bass for this part and then we are pretty much done. All right, and that is all of the major System sounds broken down for you guys, so I'll show you the full mix in a second, and there's a really cool bridge that you haven't heard yet, which uses all the same sounds, but in my opinion, it's just the coolest part of the track. I feel like it nails the System sound more than anything else, but we just didn't get to that yet, so listen out for that. If any of you guys know more about what System actually did in the studio, what they used, I would love to know, because I've never really been able to find a lot of info about it. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. Let me know what else you want to see on the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, System of a Down, let's go.